Where'd it go? I reckon I probably value closure more than most. Even when strung along on some crappy journey that I don't really care all that much for, I feel the need to see it out to its conclusion, if just so I can draw a line under it and say I saw the ending. I never like playing a game and only seeing a few minutes of it because the closure you get is very important and valuable to me. That's why I've got to get the lack of beard out there nice and early so that all of you aren't left wondering all this time. I know you can hear it in my voice. There are, in fact, many games out there that you technically can't finish because they're either too open-ended or they're like simulators which lack a solid end point. But I would prefer to talk about games that you should be able to finish, but you just can't for whatever reason. Because there are few more infuriating experiences than that kind of bullshit. For example, you can't beat Minecraft, and you're not supposed to be able to either. It's a game that procedurally generates content for you and can feasibly be played until the end of time. Lord knows there are YouTube channels doing just that. I'm way more interested in games that were initially designed with completion in mind, but for one reason or another, just aren't beatable by any conventional means. Sure, it can be frustrating and maybe even a little depressing to see all this effort go to waste, but unbeatable games are such a rare occurrence that I feel like I have to document them for future generations to look back and learn from. We lived in such barbaric times. At some point, I'd really like to talk about censorship and the ways in which it's dramatically altered some fairly iconic video games. I feel like that's a very large can of worms to open here, but I'm gonna say that censorship is generally a bad thing that results in unnecessary changes being made to games that are significantly more harmless than they may appear. However, different cultures operate with different sensibilities, and various levels of violence might fly with a Western audience, but less so with countries like China, Australia, and most of the Middle East. Then you get special cases like Germany wanting to censor Nazi imagery, which makes games like Wolfenstein look a little strange, but at least you can beat them. You know, if you want to. Germany's sensitivity surrounding Nazi symbols is very understandable and perhaps an example of genuinely justifiable censorship. But as I was researching for this video, I found out that the law the German government had in place for that was lifted in August of this year, so that's nice. I do remember when they were shaving off Hitler's moustache in video games to make sure it didn't look like him. It didn't really work. I'm a little sad that the first opportunity I get to talk in depth about I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream is detailing how censorship made this game impossible to finish. One of the best point-and-click horror games ever made came out at a time when Germany was still very concerned about any representation of World War II making its way into video games. Unsurprisingly, when one of the more interesting characters in this game, Nimdok, is unveiled as a former concentration camp doctor during the Holocaust, who slowly remembers his past life of torture and general Nazi behavior, both Germany and France decided that this was a step too far and requested that this entire chapter be removed from the game. Fair enough, but now you can't really win. The only really good ending requires all 5 main characters to sacrifice themselves, and without Nimdok, humanity gets wiped out. I think we should have a rule going forward that if at any point in the future censorship is threatening the future of all human life, maybe ease up a bit, guys. Seems like a better idea in the long run. One day I'll make a video game, but until that day, I'll continue talking about how I've never made a video game and how I feel I'd struggle to gauge a player's ability at a certain point in the game and give them a challenge that suits that. Because after all, if you give a player an impossible hurdle to overcome and they lack the resources to conquer it, they're kinda screwed. And it's one thing to end up in this awkward scenario because of a miscalculation of gaming ability and expecting the equivalent of beating the first boss with the game's ultimate weapon, but I think it's a lot more interesting when we get here because of simple oversight. It's humanizing to see a mistake as incredibly simple as shoddy currency conversion from the localization team, but you'll sober up very quickly as soon as you realize what this issue does to Tokyo Extreme Racer 3. This game never made it to Europe, which may well be a blessing in disguise considering the mistake mistakes that are made in trying to convert Japanese yen into American dollars. Honestly guys, it's not that hard. 100 yen can buy you a pencil sharpener, but not a car. It's the metric I've been using for years, don't you dare mock me. Like with other racing games like this, the money you earn for doing a decent job at the driving is used to unlock more showdowns with progressively trickier opponents. It's a really easy way of feeding success back through a loop that drives a player forward, but all you need is a crappy bit of currency conversion to put the brakes on permanently. It's roughly $1 to 100 yen, which is suddenly a very important fact when the American version of Tokyo Extreme Racer 3 doesn't actually do any conversions at all and just replaces the yen symbol with a dollar sign. So when one of the mandatory rivals requires you to have more money than the maximum amount allowed, you can't progress any further. There is absolutely no way of getting this much cash without using cheat codes or apparently some unbelievably convoluted set of exploits involving injecting the game disc and flashing your headlights. And just wouldn't it be nice if this simply worked and we didn't need any of this? There's a super special final boss waiting for you if you beat all the rivals, but it's just not attainable through normal means. You got games like Asura's Wrath hiding super bosses behind DLC, and others like Tokyo Extreme Racer 3 hiding them behind game-breaking glitches. Can't we just have the nice things? As someone who works to a schedule, or at least tries to work to a schedule until life and illness gets in the way, I simultaneously have a great deal of respect and worry for video games that are made to deadlines. The vast majority of them are nowadays because gaming is a big business and you need schedules in place in order to get things done on time, which is great. But it also promotes this crunch mentality where higher-ups force employees through 80-hour work weeks so that a game releases on time and with this fine level of detail that we've come to expect over the years. The worst thing about crunching is that it's so widespread within the industry that we as consumers are more than happy to look the other way in an effort to not be too offended by our favorite games being the result of brutal work hours. It's an especially galling habit considering that it's been happening for decades. So in 1993, Warner Brothers helped put out a Dennis the Menace film, and just a few months after that, a video game tie-in was pushed out onto a bunch of different platforms to take maximum advantage. It's actually not that bad a game, but when you're stretched for time and need to translate the same ideas onto multiple different consoles, you are virtually guaranteed to end up cutting corners and making mistakes. It's a feeling I know all too well. I still haven't thought of a way of implementing a joke about how people can subscribe to this channel if they've enjoyed this video so far and can click this bell to do something magical or whatever. The Amiga A500 port of Dennis the Menace is infamous for having an impossible to reach platform in it, only put there because developer Ocean Software ran out of time to bring over the ending or final boss and just made the game unwinnable instead. There's a platform near the end of the final level that is perfectly reachable in every other port of Dennis the Menace, but just slightly out of reach in the Amiga A500 version. Nothing can be found after this even if you do resort to hacks, so there's absolutely no way of beating this game through either conventional or unconventional means. I didn't think that a Dennis the Menace game could upset me, and yet, here we are. I need to find more important things to be annoyed about. Arcade machines are unbelievably interesting when it comes to the concept of beating them. It was the ultimate goal for kids in the 1980s during peak arcade season to defeat a game that consumes so much of their money. You want to talk about closure? That is a pretty tricky goal to work towards, especially because sometimes it was actually impossible. If you've never heard of kill screens before now, I'm about to blow your goddamn mind. With some rudimentary coding in place, many arcade machines weren't designed to be played beyond a certain point, and reaching level 256 in a lot of them caused some integer overflow, and suddenly Pac-Man looks significantly more terrifying than ever before. Famous arcade games like Duck Hunt and Galaga, and even the original Donkey Kong technically aren't beatable, since the game will continue to loop until it cracks under the pressure of having to generate new levels out of nothing. While these are incredibly interesting, they don't make for quite as intriguing a story as that of Smash TV, a game that doesn't have an ending because they didn't think they'd need one. Smash TV actually sounds a bit like a fledgling YouTube channel that launched in the wake of Smash Ultimate's release in a few weeks, but the idea of Nintendo characters beating each other up was little more than a fever dream when developer Williams were filling arcades with their dual-stick shooter game in 1990. It revolves around a futuristic game show where players compete for high scores and prizes, and also being able to survive until the next wave of enemies. It's very fun and reasonably violent, and you can see why it caught on in arcades everywhere. The thing is that Williams didn't think that anyone would be dedicated enough to defeat all these waves and collect enough keys to reach a bonus level called the Pleasure Dome, which sounds wonderful, I guess. Not sure anyone was old enough for that, what the fuck? The original release of Smash TV had no such bonus level built into the game, and so players who did everything right were greeted with very little, actually. The Pleasure Dome was mentioned a few times in-game in this release, but not actually implemented until Williams took on board all the criticism they received and released a version of Smash TV with an actual ending. So, credit for fixing the game, but getting to the Pleasure Dome is really hard. Imagine doing all that work and getting no reward for it. What kind of No Man's Sky bullshit are we dealing with here? The one saving grace for most of the games on here is that none of them are super hard monstrosities that demand hours of dedication and honed skills to conquer. That would make the lack of an ending even more harrowing, to go through all these trials and to see no tangible conclusion that you can be proud of. Imagine, if you will, battling through Dark Souls or Faster Than Light and reaching this unbreachable barrier that no amount of practice is going to help you to overcome. Yes, you should be depressed because sometimes life is like that. Sometimes you find yourself playing the inferior version of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and life feels like 1,000 punches to the face. You might imagine that crappy PC ports is only a recent problem, but it's been going on for as long as we've had computers that can play video games, and can be accomplices for some pretty awful crimes against nature. Pac-Man got the DOS treatment, as did the Elder Scrolls. You should see what they did to Mega Man. Oh god, put it away, there's kids watching, come on! The Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles from the late 80s was a massive hit on the NES, and did a great job of occupying whoever was playing it for a very long time because it was hard as shit. Like with the Dennis the Menace game though, certain ports didn't get as much care and attention, and it was the DOS version that ended up looking like it had been dragged backwards through a hedge. That would be okay if this game was beatable, but it isn't. For an unknown reason, one of the few changes made to the DOS release is that this gap between platforms in the sewer level is roughly twice as large, for literally no reason whatsoever. What's more, the ceiling is lower, so even if you jump right at the edge of the leftmost platform, you will always bump your head on the ceiling and die. Importing the game over to PC, someone has made a very normal jump into something that is actually impossible to cross without breaking out the cheat codes. Without them, the average player would reach the sewers, having battled through the rest of this game, and come unstuck every time. You thought the dam level was the most difficult part of this game? You have no idea, man. This is RabbidLuigi, and you could argue that the use of cheat codes invalidates the notion that TMNT on DOS is unbeatable, but you'd be wrong for so many different reasons. For one, cheat codes weren't exactly common knowledge in 1989, so if you were just a random kid playing this game for the first time, you would reach this impossible jump and not be able to do a damn thing about it. There's also the fact that if you need to use glitches and cheat codes in order to make your game work, maybe you should have worked a bit harder on it.